Welcome to the Unlist. Today I'm covering in a perfumer's profile video the work of Bernard Chant. Now, the previous two videos I did in this series within a series, they covered perfumers who are up there in age, but are still basically doing work, still alive, still relevant, very popular mainstream perfumers, right? I did Francois Damasci and then I did Alberto Morillas, and those two, like I said, getting on in years, but as of this video, they're still with us. And in the case of Alberto Morillas, still very much active in the perfume industry. Francois Damasci was primarily associated with Chanel and LVMH, while Alberto Morillas has been a lifelong, career-long part of Firmenich, their senior perfumer, actually. But Bernard Chant, he is, or I should say was, an old master perfumer for IFF, which is an American flavor and fragrance firm operating out of New York City. Whereas Firmenich is Swiss and Givaudan and all those other, oil houses located in Western Europe. Takasago is in Japan. IFF is notable for being American-based. So a lot of American perfume companies or perfume companies that have their largest arm operating out of America, including brands like Calvin Klein, Estee Lauder, Ralph Lauren, and also Avon when they switched over to oil houses and got rid of their internal development teams. All of those companies really leaned on IFF, and some French ones did too. Coty has used IFF. A lot of the major French design houses have also used IFF. And at the top of the echelons in IFF, like the top of their food chain, if you will, were perfumers like Josephine Catapano, Vincent Marcello, and Bernard Chant, all of which they're all gone now. But there's not a whole lot to really say about his personal history. Bernard Chant was unusually private. He did not like giving interviews. He was like Jacques Guerlain. He did not like giving interviews. He did not like talking about himself. He would give speeches at conventions or seminars involving perfume, but these were closed events. These were industry events. These weren't open to the public. So he never really fielded questions from people like you or me, right? He only spoke primarily to other perfumers. Otherwise, he was an anonymous face. Bernard Chant could have walked among you guys, and you wouldn't know what he looks like. You wouldn't know who he was. That's how he liked it, okay? Very private person. But the most noteworthy thing about him and his work is the fact that, like Jean Curleo, who was long-standing perfumer for Patou, Bernard Chant had a distinct love of the aromatic chypre, okay? Now, Jean Curleo's interests are really more material-based because he has a fixation on naturals and a fixation on fundamental fragrance structures and materials. So the thing about Jean Curleo is sandalwood, oak moss, bergamot, rose in their most natural form. That's the stuff he goes gaga for. A lot of his compositions were very rich in these materials, which is why most of them are now discontinued or reformulated into oblivion. Bernard Chant or Chant was not so specific as that. He was not so specific as that, but one could almost argue that Bernard Chant was the American equivalent of a Jean Curleo because they both had a strong love for chypre. They both had a strong love for oak moss-based accords. Both of them did. Key differences being the Jean Curleo concept was more fundamental in its execution. It was really about materials. Bernard Chant was more about accords, more about blending. He did not hyperfixate on oak moss and sandalwood, basically, or patchouli in his compositions the same way that Jean Curleo seems to with his stuff. I'm not saying one's better or one's worse, just observations on my part. But the big takeaway from this is that Bernard Chant or Chant, I'm not sure how the A is pronounced because I couldn't find a pronunciation guide on this guy's name, and he's unfortunately been dead since '92. Bernard Chant passed away. I'm just going to say Chant for the rest of the video. Bernard Chant passed away in 1992 at the age of 76. So he's basically been gone for 32 years. Just about. He's been gone for 32 years. He's been gone a while. So he has been gone longer than some of the people who love his fragrances have been alive. Think about that. He has been gone from this world longer than some of y'all who wear his fragrances have even existed in the world. So put that into perspective a little bit. He did not live to experience the huge boom of gourmands. He did not live to experience the takeover of materials like ambroxan, okay, and galaxolide. He did not live to see the takeover of all these bubblegum, shower gel, fruit chuli, BR 540, cashmere and Varanis bullshit fragrances. He did not live to see that. So if he were to come back to life right now, if Bernard Chant were to return from the grave like Beetlejuice, come up like this and go, "It's showtime," and then he were to sit down at a perfume counter and see how everything was getting put together, if he were able to see the direction of perfumes, I'm not sure what he would think. He might think some of it's kind of neat from like a scientific, from an industry point of view. He might find some fascination with it. But then on the other hand, he might also be really unhappy because he would see that all the things he loved, all the accords he fixated on, are just about gone, right? The staple of the Bernard Chant canon, effectively, of his oeuvre, if you will, if you want to use a French word, is definitely the aromatic chypre. And not just the citrus aromatic, but the floral aromatic. Just in general, he liked very aromatic, green, slightly powdery chypre compositions. So we're talking green, waxy, oily, a little bit floral, a little bit citric, definitely animalic, definitely having civet or other materials, castoreum, things like pyrrolone, aka isobutylquinoline, aka mousse de saxe accords. He was a big fan of that stuff. So if you're not a fan of things like Sheep de Coty, if you're not a fan of things like Mitsoko, if you're not a fan of things like Estee Lauder, Youth Dew, and all of that, right? That's not your cup of tea, those big, green, thick chypre compositions. You have no real business smelling his work. You have no real business because you're not going to like any of it. He did play with aldehydes. He did play with more light and fluffy floral chords, okay? He does have some floral things in his resume, right? Like Antonio's Flowers. Bernard Chant did that late in his career. He also did Sillage Blanc late in his career. So he does have some floral things, guys. Not all of his stuff. Not all of it is going to be super aromatic, super musky, but a large majority of it is, right? Even going all the way back to stuff that predates most of his Lauder work, because the bulk of Bernard Chant's compositions are defined by his work with Estee Lauder. You might say he made his career perfuming for Estee Lauder. But before that, he did stuff for Parfums Gray, like Cabochard, 1959, one of his early successes. He also did Imprévu for Coty in 1965, all right? So there are some things outside the Lauder wheelhouse that he can claim credit for that did very well. And then, like I said, the later stuff, like Antonio's Flowers, towards the end, all right? So the other thing about him, too, that bears mentioning is that Bernard Chant was not a big fan of the whole his and hers being separate concepts. And I know a lot of you vintage enthusiasts are very clear-cut, line drawn in the sand when it comes to gender norms. You like your He-Man, masculine, macho, guy pays all the bills and works and has that whole sort of, 9 to 5, I drive a Chevy and eat cheeseburgers and listen to rock music. Like, that's your vibe. I get it. It's cool. We can be friends and disagree on that. And then the women's stuff has to be super dainty and super floral, or be come hither bedroom boudoir stuff. You have this like very bifurcated concept of sexuality with your fragrances. I've done videos already on this, okay? I've done exhaustive videos on this and how stupid it all is. But I will allow you to have your opinion, obviously. I will say that Bernard Chant did not share that opinion. So if you are a vintage lover and you think the guy should stay in the office and the girl should stay in the kitchen raising the kids or whatever, the guy turns wrenches, whatever, breadwinner, the girl cooks dinner and watches The View, whatever your deal on that is, you're not going to like Bernard Chant because he doesn't like any of that. He blows all that up. He just takes a stick of TNT and he lights it and he runs away like in an old Warner Brothers cartoon, like he's got an Acme stick of dynamite. He blows up the whole gender thing. And he has gone on record. There are actually seminars, speeches he's given about his distaste for this, about how he doesn't like how men's stuff has to be just a certain way to evoke masculinity, and women's stuff has to be just a certain way to evoke femininity, and all of the social norms and all of the implications that comes with that, all the mental and emotional baggage that comes along for the ride, sans the therapy, right? The therapy is extra. You're all going to have to pay for that one. I'm not giving you that. But he was very much not a fan of that. And this is my point, the reason why I bring it up. He took out his angst on these gender norms whenever he had an opportunity to make a perfume for the other side. I say the other side because it might start off with the women's side and then have a men's version, or it might start off on the men's side and then have a women's version. But whenever he was tasked with making a perfume based off another perfume for the other side, typically it was female to male, not the other way around. He didn't usually make too many for her versions of fragrances, but whenever he made a fragrance that was marketed to women generally, so most of the Estee Lauder stuff, like I said, the 60s, 70s, most of that stuff, whenever he made the hers version, and then Lauder would say, hey, it's time to do the his version, right? He would go, like that. He'd have the evil smile on his face. He's like, okay, I'll give you the for him version, just you watch. And he was sneaky about that. And he would always create a fragrance that was barely distinguishable from the women's version. Now, there are some people that live in these weird solipsistic reality defined by perception universes where up is down and left is right and the sky is red and the grass is blue and all that stuff. And they will sit there and huff and puff and blow your house down until they're blue in the face themselves about how Aramis is definitely more manly than Cabochard, and Cabochard is clearly more feminine, and I can tell right away, and blah, blah, blah. And I am like, sit your motherfucking ass down, bitch. Because if I took both of these perfumes in their original deep fucking vintage formats, and I put them behind my back, and I blindfolded you, and I made you smell both 1959 Cabochard and 1965 Aramis, you would not fucking know which one off the top was for men or for women. You wouldn't know. That's how clever he was. Now, I can't speak for later years and reformulations and tweaks and adjustments because obviously houses do that, designers do that. But at the onset, no. At the onset, definitely not. And you can look at further examples. If the Cabochard to Aramis pipeline doesn't convince you, you could always look at the Aromatics Elixir to Aramis 900 pipeline. Same trick. Aromatics Elixir, the inaugural launch scent for the Clinique brand, 1971, Bernard Chant created probably one of his masterworks of the genre, a very oily, very aromatic, very musky, earthy, green, patchouli, oak moss, rose, chypre with spices in it. Really just salt of the earth, green, rose, chypre. I'm going to just go shy of masterpiece there because there are better things in that genre, clearly, but definitely one of his defining moments of his career. So then he was tasked with making a fragrance for Aramis. I guess one of 3 follow-ups to the original Aramis, because 2 others were released around that same time, including one called Basics, and then one called, I think it was called Chromatics. It was Chromatics and Basics, but 900 was the one he made. And it was quite literally just aromatics elixir with more musk in it. More jasmine actually in it. Surprisingly, more jasmine, more civet. It was lighter, a little bit more airy, and it had a tiny bit more of a geranium factor. The rose was still there, but they were using rose geranium in place of typical geranium, so it gave a rosy profile. But by and large, it was just a slight retooling of aromatics elixir, and honestly, they made it a bit lighter, a bit softer. Arguably, it smelled a bit more feminine in some ways because of the jasmine hedione that was in it versus the aromatics elixir. And the whole idea was to make that light, airy sort of perfume because Eau Sauvage was doing very well, and everybody wanted to have their own version of that. And then, of course, Eau de Guerlain would come out 1 year later and basically do the same thing. So that was really the Aramis attack on Eau Sauvage by Dior. It was also a very unisex perfume, in my opinion, too, because of the jasmine. So he would do that. And then from there, it gets a little murkier because it's hard to say necessarily what Devon is based off of. Devon is another one of his works, but it's not a direct adaptation of one perfume. It's kind of like a little bit azuré, a little bit alliage, you know. It's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's probably not a direct analog of any one fragrance, but it is definitely recycling, regurgitation of things found in the feminine Lauder profile, like I said. So he was very subversive in that way. That's the word I'm going to take away from this. The word I want you to know is subversive. He would take things and subvert things and basically take the agenda given to him by the perfumer brief that he was handed. The agenda that come down to the perfumer brief, that come down from the client. He would take that agenda and he would modify it to suit his own aims, which is what subversion is. He would subvert that agenda and make it his own. Again, with the Cinnabar to JHL pipeline, because Cinnabar was a fragrance made for the Estee Lauder line as a direct attack against YSL's Opium, because apparently Estee Lauder got a little bit upset at Opium. She thought it was a gussied up version of Youth Dew. So Josephine Catapano actually worked on Cinnabar alongside Bernard Chant because she had made Youth Dew, so she would know. And then, as it turns out, Estee Lauder's late husband, Joseph Harold Lauder, also liked Cinnabar, but didn't want to wear it because it was a woman's fragrance, and he had those traditional, as we discussed, those traditional bifurcated opinion of fragrances. So she basically said, hey, Josephine, can you make me men's version of this so my husband will have something to wear that he likes? She tried working with it, but Josephine Catapano never really made a male market fragrance before, so she was kind of drawing a blank. Not her thing. So she brings in Bernard, and Bernard goes, okay, I'll take care of this. And he does like very little, very, very little to Cinnabar. He actually, again, kind of makes it more light and more floral and smoother. He adds in more florals. He adds in A little bit more amber, a little bit more musk. He turns down the spices, turns up the musks, adds civet to it. Honestly, makes it a little more feminine in some ways, a little more of a boudoir scent. Cinnabar was very much a go-getter, punch you in the face, professional woman in a pinstripe suit kind of thing. JHL, even though it's marketed for men, feels more like a lace teddy. It's more like a lace teddy, you know, laying back on the bed with some soft music playing. But it was pitched to men because it was made for Estee Lauder's husband, and he wore it, and it became Joseph Harold Lauder Custom Blended Cologne. After that, like I said, Bernard Chant kind of recedes a bit from the Lauder thing. He did some other stuff late in his career through the 80s, gave some talks, gave some really well-known seminars, and then passed away in 92, like I said. It's been gone a while. But his work will forever live on as some of the most enduring of that green aromatic chypre genre. You know, the real American equivalent to someone like Jean Curleo. Some may say, you could even go so far as to say he was sort of like the American answer to Francois Coty himself, right? Because Francois Coty also liked the green aromatic style. So Bernard Chant really was the USA equivalent for that classic French chypre perfumer composition, and that was where he lived. That was his happy place. Like I said, not so strict in his materials. He played with leather, he played with aldehydes, he played with musks, and he played with orientals and amber accords too. He was not a one-trick pony by any stretch of the imagination, not a one-trick pony, but his happy place, the place where most of his work lives, is in that green patchouli oak moss. Like I said, civet, florals, leather notes, that mousse de saxe vibe in general. That's where he was happiest, and a lot of his fragrances kind of communicate that. And the other ones are outliers. You know, JHL is an outlier. Antonio's Flowers is an outlier. Sillage Blanc also an outlier. These are all outliers. So, all right, guys, that is my Perfumer's profile video on Bernard Chant. Let me know what you think in the comment section. List any of the perfumes he's done that I failed to mention that you think should get some attention, that you like, your experiences. If you have any clapbacks, anything I said about the whole gender stuff, well, hey, you know what? You don't have to agree with it, all right? It's fine. But that's Bernard Chant, too, or Chant. Look it up. He said a thing or two about how limiting. His thing was, and this is where I'll cap the video, he felt like making men's fragrances, according to the orthodoxy of the time, was very limiting. He didn't like the way men's fragrances only had this many materials that he could use, this many accords. But women's fragrances had like this many. He didn't like that. And he didn't like being put into a box. He wasn't someone that liked being painted into a box. Even though he clearly had a very well-worn lane of styles that he enjoyed making. Like I said, this green aromatic chypres was kind of where he lived. He had his favorite things, but that was his choice. He chose to stay in that lane. He didn't like other people putting him in a box. He was going to do what he was going to do. And thus, all the subversion I mentioned took place. And a lot of his compositions are very historically significant, even though, like I said, a lot of them are gone from the world. Aramis 900 discontinued, JHL discontinued. All the old Lauder stuff has been remade by Frederick Malle. I have no idea what that smells like now. It's probably a hot mess. Again, I think if Bernard Chant were to come back from the grave and see what Frederick Malle did to his babies, what he did to his perfumes, he would be upset. He would be a tiny bit peeved. All right, well, you guys have a good one. Thanks for watching the Unlist. Catch you next time.